Well, this is part 3 of a consideration of the information presented at the 2018 Be Courageous Convention of Jehovah's Witnesses, focusing on a symposium given by a number of brothers concerning the things to come. And we left off yesterday with, well, I'm going to pick it up with the same brother. I intended to play all of these in the same video, but I guess I'm too long-winded, and so I've broken it up into segments. So let me play this other short little excerpt, and we'll talk about it.
Now, though her destruction will be swift and as if in 1 hour, as is indicated in Revelation chapter 18, the key there is those words, as if in 1 hour, as if. We don't know exactly how long this is going to take. We will need courage when Babylon is destroyed. Remember, we're not a part of Babylon the Great. We have the truth, and we are not going to hide who we are at that point. And we're going to stick out like a sore thumb. So how can we develop the courage that we're going to need now? Please watch the following dramatization.
As all of Jehovah's Witnesses surely know, and those who are associated with Jehovah's Witnesses through studying or related somehow, one of the key features, a central component of the Watchtower's teaching is that we must get out of Babylon the Great and obey the command that is found in the 18th chapter of Revelation. Get out of her, my people, if you do not want to share with her in her sins. Well, the Watchtower has constructed a very elaborate and detailed explanation, considering many, many prophetic books in Revelation. And they have pointed to 1918 as the year that Babylon the Great fell and God's people were liberated. And of course, that was manifest in the way that the way things developed with the Watchtower during World War I, and after C.T. Russell passed away, there was a power struggle that ensued at Bethel, and Charles Rutherford took the reins of the organization. But shortly thereafter, the United States government brought charges of sedition against them, and Rutherford and 7 others were convicted and hauled off to the Atlanta penitentiary for a few months. They didn't stay in there very long. Their lawyers appealed, got them out. The judge overturned the thing, and that was it. But since then, the Watchtower has pointed to that event as their release from Babylonish captivity. And after Rutherford was released, he reorganized, you might say, a series of conventions. It's interesting, when Rutherford was in prison, he recognized, of course, that the Watchtower had antagonized the clergy somewhat. Nothing as to what he was going to do, but he realized that the clergy were behind the government's action against them. You know, during the fog of war, the government made this claim that the Watchtower was collaborating with the enemy, whoever that was. But anyway, when Rutherford was in prison, he said, if I ever get out of here, I'm going to take the dagger of truth and rip the guts out of Babylon the Great. And he certainly did quite a bit of damage, I would say. If you've ever read his book, Enemies, it's quite a scathing denunciation of the Roman Catholic Church in particular, and it caused quite a bit of backlash. it brought on Jehovah's Witnesses a wave of persecution in the United States during the 30s and even during World War II. But anyway, the Watchtower, as I say, has, I said constructed before, I would say fabricated a mythology as to how this fulfilled the prophecies. You know, when the Israelites were God's nation, and Jerusalem was the center of pure worship. It was Jehovah's earthly organization, as the expression goes today. It was where God caused his name to reside, as I've mentioned many times. It was a big deal when Jehovah brought the Babylonian armies in and completely destroyed Jerusalem and drug his people off. It wasn't just something that happened. God used Babylon as his instrument for destroying not just Judah and Jerusalem, but all the surrounding nations, including Egypt and Tyre and Edom and Moab and Ammon and so forth. In fact, I believe it was through Jeremiah that God told him, and this is all symbolic, that Nebuchadnezzar would come down to the region of Palestine, and he would come to a fork in the road. And if he was trying to decide which way to go, he was consulting his diviners and looking into the liver. Should I go down this road to attack these nations or off to Jerusalem? And Jehovah put a symbolic finger pointing, you're going to Jerusalem. I'm using you to punish my people for their unfaithfulness. So that was a big deal. And it was a big deal when Jehovah caused Cyrus and the Medes to bring the fall of Babylon. And in time, the Jews were released. They could not have gone back to Jerusalem had Jehovah not intervened. And incidentally, he called Cyrus in prophecy in Isaiah, my anointed one. Cyrus was a pagan. He wasn't a worshiper of Jehovah, but he prefigures Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ is going to liberate God's people from Babylon the Great. Well, the Watchtower, of course, is aware of that, and that's why they've extrapolated this elaborate mythology, because their teaching is that Jesus Christ returned in 1914 and the greater Cyrus liberated God's people from Babylon the Great. But it was just a handful of Bible students back then, wasn't it? And they weren't really restricted. The restrictions were more or less self-imposed. The government required they censor a few paragraphs in the finished mystery book, a book that's been discarded as loaded with nonsense and irrelevant ramblings. But ever since then, the call keeps being repeated, get out of Babylon the Great, as if they didn't get out in 1918 or 1919. So how do we get out of Babylon the Great now? Well, if you're a member of a church, you tell them you're resigning, you take your name off the membership rolls, and then you get out of Babylon the Great. So people that become Jehovah's Witnesses, who were not raised in the religion, as so many are now, they get out of Babylon the Great individually, even up to this present moment. The call is going out, get out of Babylon the Great, leave your church and become one of Jehovah's Witnesses. But that's not how it happened in the 5th century when Cyrus conquered Babylon. The Jews went out en masse, and Jehovah led them back to Jerusalem to rebuild it and to reestablish the worship of Jehovah in that place. So there's some problems with the Watchtower's interpretation of all these prophecies. My view as the watchman is that Jehovah's Witnesses have not gotten out of Babylon the Great yet. And the reason they have not gotten out is because they have not gone in to captivity. Now, that may sound ridiculous to some, impossible. They scoff and ridicule me. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Guy's got a beard. He's, disfellowshipped. But actually, I do know what I'm talking about. And I'll try to explain it to you briefly in this video. There is a lot to consider. But just as the release of the Jews from Babylon by Cyrus was an act of God, so too the coming captivity and release will be just as monumental. In fact, more so. To give us a foregleam, and maybe to open up some minds that are shut tight to this idea of a future captivity. The Watchtower likes to boast that since Babylon the Great fell in 1918, it can no longer hold God's people in captivity. False religion cannot restrain Jehovah's onward marching army. Well, it would appear that the Watchtower has achieved a great amount of success. It's enjoyed a lot of freedom to press its message, to send its missionaries into the far corners of the world. But look what happened recently in Russia. There's over 100,000 of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia, and since the fall of the Soviet Union, some 25 years ago, Jehovah's Witnesses have flourished. They've been able to meet openly instead of underground. They've built kingdom halls, and they built a brand new branch facility in St. Petersburg. But a few years ago, Russia began to suppress the work of Jehovah's Witnesses. First, they banned jw.org from being accessed by Russians throughout the entire network in Russia. Then they banned Jehovah's Witnesses from proselytizing on the street in Moscow. And then, most recently, Jehovah's Witnesses have been liquidated. Doesn't mean they've been rounded up and hauled off to the gulags in Siberia yet, but as an organization, they are illegal. It is illegal for them to meet together, to preach, and Russia has taken control of their beautiful branch facility and padlocked their kingdom halls. And apparently, a few of Jehovah's Witnesses have been arrested. So where is the boast? Some might say, well, that was Putin. He's this dictatorial tyrant. Well, let me tell you something about Vladimir Putin. He is a staunch Russian Orthodox. In fact, he was head of the KGB before it was disbanded in the Soviet era. During the Soviet era, which had outlawed all religion, including Russian Orthodox, it blew up their churches and so forth. He was secretly baptized as a Russian Orthodox during the Soviet era. So now he is a wholehearted Russian Orthodox. In fact, let's take a look behind me here. This is Vladimir Putin and you might call him the Pope of Russian Orthodox. They're pretty tight. So you have to believe that the Russian Orthodox Church influenced their partner, Vladimir Putin. But of course, this could not happen unless Jehovah permitted it. The same as Nebuchadnezzar never could have taken Jerusalem unless Jehovah permitted it. Sennacherib tried to take Jerusalem 150 years before. When the Assyrian army came, they took several of the cities of Judah, Lachish, and so forth, and they were ready to take Jerusalem. Sennacherib said, "No God of any nation has stopped our juggernaut. Who do you think Jehovah is?" And an angel went out and wiped out the whole army. So Jehovah did not permit it. So if anyone conquers, you might say, God's people, Christians, it is by Jehovah's permission. So it seems to be immodest for the Watchtower to boast that Babylon the Great has no influence. Doesn't mean Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia have gone back to believing the Trinity and hellfire and all that. When the Jews were in captivity to Babylon, they didn't necessarily adopt the religion of Babylon. We have the record of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They refused to bow down to the golden idol that Nebuchadnezzar erected. Daniel refused to stop praying to Jehovah and was thrown into the lion's pit. So when Jehovah called upon his people to get out of Babylon, he said, "You who are carrying the utensils of Jehovah." They were still worshiping Jehovah without the temple in Babylon. They did not adopt the religion of Babylon. So getting out of Babylon does not mean shedding our previous religious beliefs and doctrines. It means going where a new opportunity is opened up, you might say. Jehovah invited those Jews in Babylon to come back to Jerusalem and to reestablish true worship there. And if you look at the prophecies, they're going back to reestablish true worship, has a greater fulfillment when the kingdom comes and is established. A door opens, and we'll get into that. So the Watchtower's explanation that Babylon fell in 1918 and that we get out of Babylon the Great by changing our religion, that doesn't correspond to what we read in the scriptures about the Jews getting out of Babylon. And what we see now, as the example I gave of what's happening in Russia, also raises the question of the Watchtower's insistence that Babylon the Great has no authority over God's people today. Well, maybe some of you have a Bible open there. I am going to open up. Oh, I hate it when my iPad locks down. I should put it on never shutting down. But if you have a Bible there, turn it to the book of Micah and the 4th chapter. I'm going to read a few select verses here. And this is talking about God regathering his people. "In that day, declares Jehovah," this is verse 6, "I will gather the one who is limping and collect together the dispersed one, along with those I treated harshly. I will make the one who was limping a remnant, and the one far removed a mighty nation. And Jehovah will rule as king over them in Mount Zion from now on and forever. As for you, O tower of the flock, the mound of the daughter of Zion, to you it will come first. Yes, the dominion will come, the kingdom belonging to the daughter of Jerusalem." So we're talking about the kingdom. And Watchtower obviously knows this, and that they've attached all this to 1914. But there is a problem. Go on down to verse 10, or verse 9. It says, "Now, why are you shouting loudly? Have you no king? Or has your advisor perished? So that pain has seized you like a woman giving birth. Writhe and groan, O daughter of Zion, like a woman giving birth. For now you will go from the city and reside in the field. You will go as far as to Babylon, and there you will be rescued. There, Jehovah will buy you back from the hand of your enemies. Here's another problem for the Watchtower's interpretation. It used to be, not too long ago, that the Watchtower claimed that when Rutherford went off into prison and all of that, that was when God's people went into captivity to Babylon. And you could see that kind of made sense. But now, new light, when did Christians go into captivity to Babylon the Great? Back in the 4th century, when Constantine more or less hijacked Christianity. He called all the so-called bishops to Nicaea. They wanted to hammer out who Jesus was, and Constantine made himself the arbiter of this important Christian teaching, and they let him do so. And that is supposedly when Christians came into captivity to Babylon the Great. Well, you can see the Watchtower, has a case there. Christianity obviously became corrupt, and Constantine, it was a brilliant move on Satan's part to make so-called Christianity of that day the state religion of the Roman Empire, even though only a small percentage of people even claimed to be Christian. And by thus doing so, eventually all the doctrines of pagan Rome were fused into what passes now for Christianity. And we're talking about the Trinity and the idea of an immortal soul and everyone goes to heaven and all of that, the holidays, Christmas and Easter. And, Jehovah's Witnesses are well aware of that. But in prophecy here, it shows that Jehovah, again, treated his people harshly and punished them by sending them far away to Babylon. Could that be said of this compromise these corrupt Christian bishops made with Constantine? Was God punishing them by making them yoke themselves with this pagan emperor? Doesn't make sense, does it? Now let's drill down and consider this a little more closely. In verse 9, the verse I read, he says that pain has seized you like a woman giving birth. And then he says, writhe in pain, O daughter of Zion, like a woman giving birth. If you turn to the 12th chapter of Revelation, it begins with a woman standing on the sun and her head arrayed, or standing on the moon, her head arrayed in the sun, and this crown of 12 stars, and she is giving birth. She's in agony and birth pains to give birth to the male child, to the kingdom. And what happens? Her enemy, the dragon, unleashes a torrent of persecution. And this symbolic woman, where does she go? Revelation, it says, a place had been prepared for her in the wilderness, away from the face of this dragon. Well, what does it say on down in verse 10? For now you will go from the city and reside in the field, the wilderness. And then he says you will go as far as Babylon, and there you will be rescued. So this parallels what we read in Revelation, which means that when this kingdom begins to come to birth, God's people go into exile to their enemies, to Babylon the Great. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses again are going to say, that is so ridiculous. That cannot possibly happen. I would invite you to scroll up the same 4th chapter of Micah. When does this happen? This birth pangs and going into the field as far as Babylon? In the final part of the days, The mountain of the house of Jehovah will become firmly established above the top of the mountains. It will be raised up above the hills, and to it peoples will stream. He will render judgment among many peoples and set matters straight, respecting mighty nations far away. So in the final part of the days, God's kingdom asserts itself. And that is when God rescues his people from Babylon. But it's also when they go into captivity to Babylon for a brief period. And that's what he was saying, that, excuse me, I treated you harshly, and I will make the one who was limping a remnant, the anointed remnant. He punishes them, as I mentioned in a previous video, the slave that did not know his master's will, and so did things deserving of strokes, he will be beaten with a few strokes. He'll be punished, made to limp, dispersed, humiliated. And then the rescue comes. So it goes on to point out that when God restores his people, then they are empowered to conquer their enemies. And that's what will take place after this purge, after the sealing occurs, but before all of this remnant are united with Christ in heaven itself. And I'll expound upon that a little bit more, because one of the symposiums that we'll consider is the coming judgment message. So thanks for watching today's Daily Word. And I noticed that my videos on YouTube, they get a few, thumbs up. People like them, and I would request, if you like these videos, I would hope it would be more than like. I hope that you value the information. I would ask you to pass it on, to share this information. It's very easy to do on the internet. Clickety-click, you send an email to someone, post a link on your wherever, your social platform network. And I like to see my videos become more, I don't want to say going viral, but to gain a wider audience, particularly among Jehovah's Witnesses. So if you have a friend or an elder, ask them to look at these and comment on them if they wish. Of course, mostly their minds are closed, and they're very, militant in a way, but, I keep chipping away, and I'm sure Jehovah's word in the end will prevail. So again, thank you, and see you tomorrow.